The Memory Shop. In a dimly lit alley that seemed forgotten by time itself, there existed a shop with no name. Its only indication of existence was a modest wooden sign that read, "Authentic Memories for Sale." The alley was one of those places in the city that didn't seem to fit on any map. A narrow passage lined with mismatched cobblestones and overgrown ivy that framed its entrances. The shop appeared to belong there, its facade neither remarkable nor inviting, as if its purpose was to remain unnoticed. Yet, for those who happened to stumble upon it, the allure was undeniable. The window display was a peculiar collage of objects, each one seemingly plucked from a different era. A Roman coin rested beside a digital wristwatch. A feathered quill leaned against a sleek fountain pen. A tattered playing card sat atop a gleaming smartphone. To the casual observer, it appeared to be a second-hand shop with an eclectic inventory. But for the few who pushed open its creaky door, it was something far more extraordinary. Inside, the air was thick with the scent of old paper and polished wood, and the dim lighting cast long, wavering shadows across the floor. Shelves stretched from floor to ceiling, packed with items that bore the weight of time. Rusted keys, fragments of stained glass, faded photographs, and countless other curiosities. Each item was carefully labeled with a date and description written in an elegant hand. Napoleon's lost cufflink, 1815, a fragment of the Berlin Wall, 1989, the button that fell from a suit, 1963, Dallas. The shopkeeper was as enigmatic as the shop itself. They seemed neither young nor old, neither male nor female, their presence a nebulous constant that eluded memory. Those who visited the shop often found themselves struggling to recall the shopkeeper's face, as though their features dissolved the moment one looked away. Their voice, however, lingered, low and melodic, with an accent that defied categorization. The shopkeeper offered no explanation for the shop's existence, only a cryptic assurance that every item held a memory, a doorway to the past. Customers were encouraged to choose carefully, for the experience was as vivid as living it firsthand. The shopkeeper would lean in close, their eyes glinting with some unreadable emotion, and whisper the rules. You may observe but not interfere. You may feel but not act. The past must remain untouched, for it is as fragile as glass. For years, the shop had drawn an eclectic clientele, scholars seeking historical clarity, thrill seekers chasing the adrenaline of witnessing pivotal moments, and those longing for a glimpse of a world they would never know. No one left unchanged, and no one ever found the shop a second time. It was on a rainy evening that Eleanor Mayfield discovered the shop. She wasn't supposed to be in that part of the city. She had taken a wrong turn while walking home, her thoughts clouded by the dull ache of a particularly uninspiring day. Eleanor was a history professor, though her enthusiasm for the subject had waned over the years. The endless bureaucracy of academia had sapped her joy, leaving her disillusioned and tired. The neon glow of the shop's sign caught her eye, cutting through the misty rain like a beacon. She paused, her curiosity piqued. She couldn't explain why, but the sight of it stirred something within her, a faint glimmer of the passion she thought she had lost. With a hesitant push, she opened the door, and the bell above it chimed softly, as though acknowledging her arrival. The interior of the shop was a feast for the senses. Eleanor's eyes darted from one shelf to the next, drawn to the sheer variety of artifacts. She reached out to touch a gilded compass labeled, recovered from HMS Endeavour, 1770, but stopped short when she heard the shopkeeper's voice behind her. Every item has a story, they said, their voice both soothing and unsettling. And every story has a price. Eleanor turned, startled by their sudden appearance. The shopkeeper stood motionless, their hands clasped in front of them. There was an air of authority about them, as though they were not just the shop's owner but its guardian. "Is it true?" Eleanor asked, her voice hesitant. "Do these take you to the past?" The shopkeeper tilted their head slightly, as if amused by her question. "Each item holds the memory of its moment. When you hold it, you become a witness to its story. You see, you feel, but you cannot change. The past must remain undisturbed." Eleanor hesitated. The rational part of her mind wanted to dismiss the shop as a clever illusion, a place where desperate people sought solace in fabricated experiences. But something about the shop felt different, authentic. She couldn't ignore the pull. Her eyes fell on a delicate silver locket displayed in a glass case. Its label read, "Last Dance Before the Titanic Sinks, 1912. The date sent a shiver down her spine. She had spent years teaching about the Titanic, but to see it, to feel its tragedy unfold, that was a temptation she couldn't resist. She gestured toward the locket, and the shopkeeper's expression became solemn. "A powerful choice," they said. "The price is steep, but the experience, priceless." Eleanor nodded, handing over a sum of money that made her wince. The shopkeeper retrieved the locket with deliberate care, placing it in her hands. "Remember," they said, their voice low and firm, "you may only observe." The moment Eleanor closed her fingers around the locket, the room seemed to tilt. Her vision blurred, and a rush of cold air enveloped her. When she opened her eyes, she was no longer in the shop. She stood in a grand ballroom, its opulent chandeliers casting a warm glow over the elegantly dressed passengers of the Titanic. The air was filled with music, a lively waltz played by an orchestra on a raised platform. Laughter and conversation mingled with the clinking of glasses as couples danced across the polished floor. Eleanor was invisible, her presence a ghostly shadow that moved unnoticed among the revelers. She wandered through the room, her heart pounding as she took in the sights and sounds. It was everything she had imagined and more, a world frozen in time, unaware of the impending tragedy. But as the night wore on, a sense of unease began to settle over her. She couldn't shake the knowledge of what was to come. Her gaze lingered on the faces of the passengers, the young couple sharing a quiet laugh, the elderly man sipping his wine with a contented smile. She wanted to warn them, to scream that they were running out of time, but she couldn't. Eleanor moved toward the orchestra, watching as the conductor led the musicians with practiced precision. She noticed the strain in his expression, the way his hands trembled ever so slightly. It was a detail she had never read about, and it made the scene feel achingly real. The weight of the moment became unbearable. Eleanor clutched the locket, willing herself to return to the shop, but nothing happened. Panic surged within her as the realization set in. She was still bound to this moment. The music changed. The ship shuddered faintly beneath her feet. Eleanor stood frozen as the faint shudder beneath her feet rippled through the opulent ballroom. The passengers, engrossed in their dancing and conversations, either didn't notice or chose to ignore the subtle shift. Yet, to Eleanor, it was as if the entire atmosphere had changed. The warmth of the chandeliers now felt oppressive, the music too loud, the laughter tinged with an edge of desperation. She wanted to scream, to shake the oblivious revelers from their blissful ignorance, but the rules of the shopkeeper's warning echoed in her mind. You may observe, but not interfere. Her invisible presence allowed her to move freely through the crowded room, her feet carrying her toward the edges of the celebration. She reached a set of double doors leading to the ship's deck, her hand passing through the handle as though it were nothing but mist. The biting cold outside struck her like a wall, the ocean stretching endlessly under a sky scattered with stars. Crew members bustled about in hushed urgency, their faces pale and drawn. Eleanor moved to the ship's railing, her gaze fixed on the horizon. The iceberg loomed like a silent predator, its jagged form barely visible in the faint moonlight. It was closer than she had expected, and the sight of it sent a shiver down her spine. She turned to look at the lifeboats, still secured tightly to the deck. The reality of the impending disaster hit her like a blow. The ship would strike in minutes. The sequence of events played out in her mind like a grim script she had studied countless times. Panic, chaos, heartbreak. Eleanor had spent years teaching the tragedy of the Titanic, presenting it as a cautionary tale of human arrogance and vulnerability. Yet standing here, watching it unfold, she felt the weight of history in a way she never had before. But something was wrong. As she scanned the deck, Eleanor noticed a man standing near one of the lifeboats, a figure she didn't recognize from any historical records. He wore a dark coat and a bowler hat pulled low over his face. Unlike the crew, he moved with a calm deliberation that seemed out of place amidst the growing tension. He reached into his coat and pulled out a small device, something metallic and angular that glinted faintly in the moonlight. Eleanor moved closer, her curiosity overriding her sense of dread. The man's hands worked quickly, adjusting the device before placing it against the hull of the ship. A faint hum emanated from it, almost imperceptible against the noise of the ocean. As Eleanor watched, the iceberg's position seemed to waver, its edges blurring as if it were a mirage. Her mind raced. What is he doing? This wasn't part of history. The iceberg wasn't supposed to move. The man stepped back, his device now emitting a steady pulse of light. For a fleeting moment, Eleanor thought she saw the iceberg shift further away, the ship's trajectory altering ever so slightly. The man turned and walked briskly toward the staircase leading back to the ballroom, his device tucked away beneath his coat. Eleanor followed him, her heart pounding. She couldn't explain how or why, but she knew he didn't belong here. His actions defied the rules of observation. He wasn't just witnessing the past, he was altering it. The man descended the staircase, moving through the ballroom with the ease of someone accustomed to blending in. He passed the orchestra without a glance, weaving through the crowd with a fluidity that made him difficult to track. Eleanor pushed through the sea of dancers, her intangible form slipping unnoticed between them. When the man reached a side corridor, he stopped and pulled out his device again. Eleanor edged closer, her eyes locked on the strange contraption. It looked like a cross between a pocket watch and a handheld scanner, its surface etched with glowing runes that shifted as he manipulated its dials. The corridor seemed to ripple around him, the walls warping subtly as if reality itself were bending. Eleanor felt a pull, an invisible force drawing her toward the device. Her instincts screamed at her to retreat, but her curiosity overpowered her fear. The man pressed a button on the device, and the hum intensified. The ripple spread outward, and for a brief moment, Eleanor saw flashes of another place. An unfamiliar room filled with blinking monitors and glowing consoles. The scene flickered, and then the corridor returned to normal. The man exhaled sharply, tucking the device back into his coat. He glanced around, his eyes passing directly through Eleanor without recognition. Satisfied that he was alone, he continued down the corridor, disappearing into the shadows. Eleanor remained rooted in place, her mind racing. The device wasn't just altering the trajectory of the iceberg, it was tearing at the fabric of time itself. Whatever the man was doing, it wasn't meant to happen here. She moved back toward the ballroom, the weight of her discovery pressing heavily on her chest. The music played on, the passengers oblivious to the chaos unfolding beneath their feet. Eleanor scanned the room, searching for any sign of the man, but he was gone. The ship shuddered again, more violently this time. A gasp rippled through the crowd as the chandeliers swayed, their crystals casting fractured light across the walls. The orchestra faltered, the musicians exchanging uneasy glances before resuming their performance. Eleanor's gaze shifted to the locket in her hand. She clutched it tightly, willing herself back to the shop, but the shimmering transition refused to come. She was trapped, bound to this moment by forces she couldn't comprehend. She moved toward the grand staircase, her steps quickening as she ascended to the upper deck. The cold air hit her like a slap, the wind howling as the ship's officers shouted orders. Passengers were beginning to gather, their faces pale with confusion and fear. The lifeboats were being lowered, but the process was agonizingly slow. Eleanor turned her attention to the iceberg. It was no longer visible, its presence erased from the timeline. Yet the ship still listed to one side, its fate seemingly unchanged. The man's actions had delayed the collision, but they hadn't prevented it. Eleanor felt the locket grow warm in her hand, the heat spreading through her fingers like a pulse. The air around her shimmered, and for a moment, she thought she saw the shopkeeper's face, their expression unreadable. "You cannot change the past," their voice echoed, distant and hollow. "But someone has tried. The balance is fragile, and you are now part of it." The vision faded, leaving Eleanor alone on the deck. The ship's fate was sealed, but the man's interference had introduced a fracture, a tear in the tapestry of time. Eleanor's heart raced as she realized the implications. The shop had warned her not to interfere, but it hadn't warned her about others. She wasn't just an observer. She was a witness to an unraveling. Eleanor stood on the freezing deck of the Titanic, clutching the locket as the ship tilted further, its end creeping closer with each passing moment. The cold air stung her face, and the panic of the passengers around her felt like a tangible force. Lifeboats were being lowered into the icy waters, their occupants shouting for loved ones to hurry. Amid the chaos, Eleanor's thoughts were fixed on the man with the device. She had spent her life studying history, cherishing its immutability. But now, the very foundation of her beliefs had been shaken. If someone could tamper with the past, how much of what she knew, of what anyone knew, was true? And worse, how far could the damage extend? The iceberg was gone. Its absence was an unthinkable anomaly, yet the ship was still doomed. Eleanor realized with dawning horror that the man's intervention hadn't saved anyone. It had only delayed the inevitable. The fractures in time were still there, invisible to the passengers but painfully evident to her. She had to find him. Eleanor moved through the crowd, her intangible presence allowing her to slip unnoticed past the frantic passengers and overwhelmed crew. She scanned every face, searching for the man's dark coat and bowler hat. He couldn't have gone far. The ship was massive, but it was also a prison of steel and desperation. The lifeboats creaked as they descended, some barely half full despite the chaos. The orchestra continued to play, their music carrying a haunting beauty that felt both comforting and tragic. Eleanor couldn't shake the feeling that she was running out of time, not just for the Titanic, but for herself. As she descended into the lower decks, the air grew warmer, heavier, filled with the scent of oil and seawater. The corridors were narrow and dimly lit, their walls vibrating faintly as the ship groaned under the strain of its impending fate. Here, in the bowels of the vessel, the panic was different. It was quieter, more resigned, the passengers clinging to hope in silence. Eleanor felt a strange pull, a sensation that guided her steps as if the locket itself were leading her. She rounded a corner and stopped abruptly. There he was, the man in the bowler hat, standing in front of a bulkhead door. His device was in his hand, its soft hum barely audible over the distant sounds of chaos. She moved closer, her invisible form passing through the shadows like a specter. The man adjusted the device, and the air around him shimmered. Eleanor watched in disbelief as the bulkhead door appeared to ripple, its surface distorting like water. Beyond it, she caught a glimpse of something impossible, a room filled with glowing consoles and sleek metallic walls, its design utterly alien to the Titanic. The man stepped through the bulkhead, disappearing into the distortion. Eleanor hesitated, her heart pounding. She didn't understand what she was chasing, but she knew she couldn't let him vanish. She gripped the locket tightly and stepped through the shimmering portal. The transition was instantaneous. Eleanor found herself standing in the same futuristic room she had glimpsed through the portal. The walls were lined with monitors displaying streams of data in unfamiliar symbols. The air buzzed with energy, and the hum of machinery filled the space. The man stood at a central console, his back to her, his device now connected to a glowing interface. Eleanor moved closer, her steps silent. Though she couldn't touch or speak, she felt an urgent need to understand what he was doing. The monitors displayed images of the Titanic, its outline flickering as if caught between two realities. The iceberg was gone, its absence creating ripples in the timelines displayed on the screens. Each ripple branched outward, creating new paths, some dim and fading, others glowing with unstable energy. The man typed rapidly, his movements precise and practiced. A new image appeared on the monitors. A city skyline filled with towering spires and shimmering lights, its architecture unlike anything Eleanor had ever seen. It was a vision of the future, but something about it felt wrong. The spires bent unnaturally, and the light that filled the city pulsed erratically, as if the timeline itself were tearing apart. Eleanor realized with a jolt that this was the man's goal. He wasn't trying to save the Titanic or correct history. He was shaping it to serve his own ends. The locket in Eleanor's hand grew warm again, the heat spreading through her palm like a warning. She looked down at it, its surface shimmering with faint light. For the first time, she wondered if it was more than just a portal. Perhaps it was a key, a tool designed not only to witness but to intervene. The thought was both thrilling and terrifying. The shopkeeper's warning rang in her mind. You may observe but not interfere. But how could she stand by and do nothing? She focused on the man, willing the locket to respond. To her astonishment, the air around her began to shimmer, the edges of her form becoming less ethereal. The man turned suddenly, his eyes widening in shock as he saw her. You shouldn't be here, he said, his voice sharp and filled with something akin to fear. Eleanor didn't respond. She didn't know how she had broken the barrier between observer and participant, but she wasn't going to waste the opportunity. She moved toward the console, her fingers reaching for the device. The man lunged, but his movements were slow, disoriented. Eleanor's hand closed around the device, and the moment she touched it, the room was flooded with light. She was back on the Titanic, the ballroom around her alive with motion and sound. The music played, the passengers danced, and the iceberg loomed once more on the horizon. Eleanor gasped, her chest heaving as she clutched the locket. The man was gone, his interference erased. The ship shuddered, and Eleanor knew what was coming. But this time, it felt different. The tragedy of the Titanic was no longer a distant story or a historical footnote. It was a living, breathing moment. She watched as the passengers laughed, unaware of their fate, and felt a profound sense of connection to them. The locket grew warm again, its pulse steady and calming. Eleanor felt the familiar pull, the sensation of the shop calling her back. She closed her eyes, the ballroom fading into darkness. When she opened them, she was standing in the shop once more. The shelves were as she had left them, the objects glowing faintly under the dim light. The shopkeepers stood behind the counter, their expression unreadable. You interfered, they said, their tone devoid of accusation. Eleanor placed the locket on the counter, her hand trembling. I had to. He was changing things. The shopkeeper nodded slowly, as if they had expected her response. The past is fragile, but so is the present. Sometimes, balance requires more than observation. Eleanor's chest tightened. Who was he? The shopkeeper didn't answer. Instead, they took the locket and placed it back in the glass case, its label unchanged. The choice to act is rare, they said. But you chose well. Eleanor left the shop that evening with more questions than answers. The alley behind her was empty, the shop sign dark and unassuming. But she carried the weight of what she had seen, what she had done. For the first time in years, she felt alive. Eleanor left the shop with an unsettling sense of clarity. The weight of what she had experienced pressed heavily on her chest, yet it was tempered by a newfound purpose. She walked through the rain-slicked streets, the distant hum of the city a faint reminder of the ordinary world she had returned to. But ordinary no longer felt like the right word. Everything seemed sharper, more vivid, as though her perception had been fundamentally altered. She paused at the edge of the alley, glancing back at the shadowy corner where the shop had stood. The glowing sign was gone, replaced by an unremarkable brick wall. Her fingers instinctively brushed against the fabric of her coat where the locket had been. Though she had left it behind, the warmth of its presence lingered. The shopkeeper's cryptic words echoed in her mind. The choice to act is rare, but you chose well. Eleanor wondered if that was true. She had broken the rules of observation, stepping beyond the bounds of what the shopkeeper had warned her was possible. But she couldn't ignore the man she had encountered, the one who had altered the course of history with cold precision and the device that bent the fabric of time. The following days blurred together. Eleanor tried to return to her routine, lecturing on the events of history with a newfound intensity that captivated her students. Yet her nights were restless, filled with vivid dreams of shifting timelines and golden threads unraveling in the void. The memories of the Titanic lingered, not just as facts or anecdotes, but as a lived experience etched into her soul. She could feel the cold metal of the ships railing under her fingertips, hear the haunting strains of the orchestra, and see the faces of those who had danced on the edge of oblivion. One night, as Eleanor prepared to sleep, she noticed something unusual on her desk. A small envelope lay there, its edges slightly worn, as though it had traveled a great distance. She hadn't placed it there, and no one else had been in her apartment. Her hands trembled slightly as she opened it, revealing a single piece of paper with a message written in the same elegant hand as the shop's labels. Time remembers you now. Choose your steps carefully. There was no signature, no indication of who had sent it or how it had arrived. But the weight of its meaning was unmistakable. Eleanor had altered the flow of time, and the ripple effects of her actions would not go unnoticed. In the weeks that followed, Eleanor began to notice subtle anomalies in her surroundings. Objects seemed to appear in places she didn't remember leaving them. Conversations with friends and colleagues occasionally veered into topics that felt unfamiliar, as though they were referencing events that hadn't occurred in her reality. Once, while walking through a crowded park, she caught a glimpse of a man in a dark coat and bowler hat disappearing into the crowd. At first, she tried to dismiss these occurrences as tricks of her mind, remnants of the disorienting experience she had endured. But as they grew more frequent, she could no longer ignore them. Something, or someone, was watching her. One evening, as she walked home from campus, the streetlights flickered, casting long shadows that seemed to stretch unnaturally across the pavement. She felt a presence behind her, an almost imperceptible shift in the air. When she turned, she saw him. The man from the Titanic, standing beneath a street lamp, his bowler hat tilted forward to obscure his face. Eleanor's breath caught in her throat, and for a moment, neither of them moved. Then he turned and began walking away, his steps deliberate and unhurried. Without thinking, Eleanor followed, her heart pounding as she trailed him through the winding streets. He led her to an abandoned building on the outskirts of the city, its facade crumbling and overgrown with ivy. The door was ajar, and the faint hum of machinery emanated from within. Eleanor hesitated at the threshold, her instincts screaming at her to turn back. But curiosity and determination pushed her forward. The interior of the building was a stark contrast to its decayed exterior. The walls were lined with sleek consoles and glowing monitors, their screens displaying streams of data in the same cryptic symbols she had seen in the man's device. The air was thick with energy, the hum resonating in her chest like a second heartbeat. The man stood at the center of the room, his back to her as he worked at one of the consoles. He didn't turn as he spoke, his voice low and steady. "You shouldn't have followed me." Eleanor stepped closer, her fear giving way to anger. "Who are you? What are you doing?" He turned then, his expression unreadable. "I am a collector," he said simply. "I gather moments of time, fragments of existence." The Titanic was an experiment. "An experiment?" Eleanor repeated, her voice rising. "You altered history. You erased the iceberg. Do you have any idea what you've done?" The man's gaze didn't waver. The iceberg was a variable. Its presence or absence was irrelevant to the outcome. The ship was always destined to sink. His words sent a chill through Eleanor. "You knew? Then why?" "To observe," he interrupted. "To understand how time responds to disruption. Every fracture reveals something new." Eleanor shook her head, her mind reeling. "You're playing with lives. Do you even care about the consequences?" He smiled faintly, a hint of something almost like pity in his eyes. "Consequences are inevitable. My role is not to prevent them, but to document them." Eleanor's hands clenched into fists. "And what about me? Why was I there?" The man tilted his head, studying her as though she were a particularly intriguing artifact. "You were unexpected. The shop, it's selective. It doesn't choose lightly. Perhaps it saw something in you." Before Eleanor could respond, the room shuddered, the monitors flickering as the hum grew louder. The man glanced at the consoles, his expression darkening. "You shouldn't have come here," he said, his tone suddenly urgent. "This place isn't stable." Eleanor took a step back as the floor beneath her feet seemed to ripple like water. The walls blurred, and for a moment, she thought she saw the golden threads of time weaving through the air. The man moved toward her, his hand outstretched. "You need to leave. Now." She hesitated, her instincts screaming at her to flee, but her curiosity held her in place. "What is this place?" she demanded. "An echo," he said, "a fragment of a timeline that never was. If it collapses, you'll be trapped in it." The floor buckled again, and Eleanor stumbled. The locket around her neck, she didn't remember putting it on, grew warm, its pulse steady and insistent. The man's eyes widened slightly as he noticed it. "The shopkeeper gave you that?" Eleanor nodded, gripping the locket tightly. "Then you might have a chance," he said. "Use it. Now." The room dissolved into chaos, the walls disintegrating into streams of light. Eleanor closed her eyes, focusing on the locket's warmth. The familiar pull enveloped her, and the last thing she heard was the man's voice. "We'll meet again." Eleanor woke in her apartment, the early morning light filtering through the curtains. The locket lay on her desk, its surface cool and inert. She sat up slowly, her mind racing as she tried to make sense of what had happened. The collector's words lingered, a reminder that her journey was far from over. The shop was gone, but its presence was etched into her memory. Eleanor knew she couldn't return to her old life. Not entirely. She had been pulled into something far greater, a web of time and choice that stretched beyond comprehension. For now, she would wait. But she knew that when the shop, or the collector, called again, she would be ready. The Collector of Mistakes. For as long as he could remember, Daniel Armitage had been obsessed with the mistakes of his past. The small missteps that others might shrug off as insignificant lingered in his mind like open wounds, refusing to heal. But his life changed radically the day he discovered his unusual ability. He could travel through time, but with one peculiar limitation. He could only return to moments where he had made significant mistakes. The first time it happened was an accident. One night, while sifting through a pile of unpaid bills, Daniel's mind was flooded with the memory of a fight he'd had with his best friend, Sam. A fight that had ended their friendship. It was a moment he had spent years trying to forget. He wished, with every fiber of his being, that he could undo it. Suddenly, the world around him tilted, the air thickened, and everything dissolved into darkness. When he opened his eyes, he was standing in the bar where the fight had taken place. The scene was eerily familiar. The scent of spilled beer, the murmur of overlapping conversations, and Sam in front of him, his face twisted with the same anger Daniel remembered. In that instant, Daniel realized he wasn't just reliving a memory, he had traveled back in time. This wasn't nostalgia, it was a second chance. In the months that followed, Daniel tested the limits of his ability, trying to understand its rules. He discovered that he couldn't choose the moments he traveled to. Something, or perhaps the timeline itself, seemed to decide for him. The power pulled him to moments of deep regret, places where his choices had left scars on his life or others. Not all of them were earth-shattering tragedies. Sometimes, it was a careless word that had destroyed a relationship. Other times, it was a hasty decision that had set off an unforeseen chain of events. At first, Daniel considered his ability a gift. He thought he could fix everything, rewrite his life into something closer to perfection. But he soon realized that every change he made rippled outward, creating consequences he couldn't predict. A word unsaid, a gesture altered, a path untaken. Each adjustment sent shockwaves through the fabric of time. One night, as he lay awake, his mind turned to the memory that haunted him most. An accident in which he had hit a cyclist while glancing at his phone. The image of the cyclist's helmet striking the pavement replayed endlessly in his thoughts, a loop of guilt and shame that refused to let go. Daniel knew that this moment would eventually call him back, and when it did, he had to be ready. That moment came sooner than he expected. The familiar dizziness that accompanied his temporal shifts engulfed him, and when he opened his eyes, he was in the driver's seat of his old sedan. The headlights illuminated the dark road ahead, and the faint glow of his phone screen drew his attention. Daniel's breath caught in his throat. He knew this scene all too well, the fateful moment he had glanced down at a text message. The car hummed beneath him, and he felt the weight of inevitability pressing against his chest. But this time, he had the power to act differently. Without hesitation, Daniel dropped the phone onto the passenger seat and gripped the wheel tightly. As the cyclist appeared in the distance, pedaling steadily along the shoulder of the road, Daniel veered sharply to the side, giving the bike a wide berth. The car jolted as it hit the gravel on the edge of the road, but Daniel managed to stop it before any harm was done. He exhaled shakily, relief washing over him. The cyclist pedaled onward, unaware of the close call. But just as Daniel began to process what had happened, his relief turned to dread. In his rearview mirror, he saw another car swerving violently to avoid the sudden maneuver he had made. The vehicle skidded off the road and collided with a tree. The sound of the crash echoed in the still night air. Daniel was wrenched back to his present, gasping for breath as though he had been underwater. He sat in his darkened apartment, his hands trembling. The memory of the crash replayed in his mind, and he knew that while he had avoided one mistake, he had caused another. Frantically, he searched the news the next day and found what he had feared. The driver of the other car had been severely injured. Daniel's actions had saved the cyclist, but at the cost of someone else's safety. It was a grim trade-off, and it left him questioning the true nature of his ability. As the days passed, Daniel began to notice a disturbing pattern. Every time he altered the past, the timeline seemed to push back, like a taut thread trying to snap back into place. His corrections never yielded the perfect outcome he imagined. Instead, they created new problems, new regrets. The idea of perfection began to feel like an illusion. Then came the moment that changed everything. One evening, Daniel was flipping through an old photo album, a ritual he found oddly comforting. Each photo was a window into a moment he couldn't change, a snapshot of choices already made. But one image stopped him cold, a picture of his 8th birthday party. He remembered the day vividly. The celebration had ended in tears after he'd said something cruel to his younger brother, Ethan. Even now, their relationship was strained, and that memory lingered as the beginning of the rift. Before he could think twice, the shift overtook him. When the dizziness subsided, Daniel found himself standing in his childhood backyard. The sound of laughter and chatter filled the air, a stark contrast to the silence of his adult life. Colorful balloons swayed gently in the breeze, tied to a picnic table piled high with birthday presents. 8-year-old Daniel sat at the head of the table, a paper crown tilted precariously on his head, his face lit with excitement. Ethan, 5 years old at the time, was seated to his left, his small hands clutching a poorly wrapped gift. The image was a perfect snapshot of innocence, until Daniel's memory filled in the rest. He knew what would happen next. Ethan would present the gift, a poorly made drawing of the two of them holding hands, and Daniel, in a childish fit of impatience, would ridicule it in front of everyone. It was the kind of thoughtless cruelty children often didn't understand until much later. Daniel felt the weight of the moment pressing down on him. This was his chance to undo it, to rewrite the fracture in their relationship. He approached cautiously, aware that his invisible presence was merely a passenger in the scene. 8-year-old Daniel looked up as Ethan offered the gift, his small face radiating pride. "This is for you," Ethan exclaimed, his voice bright and eager. The younger Daniel tore at the wrapping paper with impatient hands, revealing the drawing. His smile faltered as he stared at the childish scrawl, a crude depiction of 2 stick figures standing beneath a rainbow. "What is this?" young Daniel blurted out, his tone dripping with disdain. "It doesn't even look like us." Ethan's face crumpled instantly, his bottom lip trembling. The surrounding adults fell silent, their laughter replaced by awkward tension. Ethan ran from the table, the gift abandoned and crumpled in Daniel's lap. Watching the scene unfold, adult Daniel clenched his fists. He wanted to reach out, to intervene, to stop himself from saying the words that would plant the seeds of distance between him and his brother. But he knew the rules. He was only an observer. Or was he? Daniel felt the locket around his neck pulse faintly, a heat that spread through his chest. It was the same sensation he'd felt during his encounter with the man on the Titanic. He closed his eyes and focused, willing himself to interact with the moment. The air shimmered, and suddenly, he wasn't just an observer anymore. He was there, solid and visible, standing between his younger self and Ethan. The crowd froze, their faces a blur of incomprehension. Ethan stared at Daniel, his wide eyes filled with confusion and fear. "Who are you?" he whispered, clutching the drawing tightly. Daniel hesitated, his heart pounding. He had broken the barrier again, crossing into a space he wasn't sure he could control. But this was his chance, a rare opportunity to correct the past directly. He crouched down, meeting Ethan's gaze. Someone who knows how much this gift means," he said, his voice steady despite the chaos swirling in his mind. "Your drawing is beautiful, Ethan. It's a gift from your heart, and it's perfect just the way it is." Ethan's eyes searched his face, unsure whether to believe him. Slowly, He extended the drawing. Daniel took it with careful hands, holding it as if it were a priceless artifact. "You're going to do amazing things one day," Daniel said softly. "And this is just the beginning." The scene began to shift. The locket pulsed again, and Daniel felt the world blur around him. As he faded from view, he caught a final glimpse of Ethan's face, now filled with a hesitant but genuine smile. When Daniel returned to his present, he felt an unfamiliar mixture of relief and apprehension. He immediately grabbed his phone and called Ethan, his hands trembling as he waited for his brother to answer. "Hey, Daniel," Ethan said, his voice casual but warm. "Hey," Daniel replied, trying to keep his voice steady. "I was just thinking about you. How's everything going?" Ethan paused, a note of surprise in his tone. "That's random, but good, I guess. You okay?" "I'm fine," Daniel said quickly. "I just wanted to check in." "Thanks, man. That means a lot," Ethan replied, his tone softening. "I've been meaning to call you, too. It's been too long." The conversation was brief, but it left Daniel feeling a flicker of hope. He had altered the moment, changed the trajectory of their relationship, but at what cost? The next day, Daniel began noticing changes in his surroundings. The photo album he had flipped through before the jump was now different. The picture from his 8th birthday had shifted. Instead of Ethan running from the table, it now showed the two of them holding the drawing together, smiling. At first, Daniel felt a sense of triumph. But as he examined the album further, he noticed other anomalies. Certain photos depicted events he didn't remember, people he didn't recognize. The threads of his life were unraveling, rearranging themselves in response to his interference. The final blow came when Daniel received a message from an old college friend. It was a simple note. "Hey, it's been a while. Do you still work in finance?" Daniel frowned. He had never worked in finance. He replied hesitantly, asking for clarification. The friend responded with a string of details that didn't match Daniel's life at all. A career path he hadn't taken, a city he had never lived in, a wife he didn't know. Panic set in as Daniel realized the scope of what he had done. By altering one moment, he had created ripples that reshaped not just his relationship with Ethan, but the entire fabric of his timeline. That night, as Daniel tried to sleep, the locket around his neck grew warm again. He sat up, clutching it tightly, and felt the familiar pull of another jump. But this time, it wasn't to a specific moment in his past. He opened his eyes to find himself in a void, a vast, endless expanse of golden light, where threads of time stretched out in all directions. Each thread was a different version of his life, twisting and intertwining with others. He saw fragments of himself in each one, laughing with Ethan, grieving alone, standing on the Titanic's deck, and countless other versions he couldn't comprehend. A voice echoed through the void, deep and resonant. "You cannot undo the past without unraveling the present." Daniel turned, searching for the source of the voice, but saw only the endless threads. "Who are you?" he called out. "I am the keeper of the threads," the voice replied. "Your actions have disrupted the balance. The locket has chosen you to mend what you have broken." Daniel's chest tightened. "I just wanted to fix my mistakes," he said. "And in doing so, you have created new ones," the keeper said. "Your journey is far from over. You must choose carefully, for every action has a cost." The threads began to pulse, their light growing brighter. Daniel felt the pull of another jump, his body dissolving into the golden expanse. Daniel emerged from the golden void with the unsettling sensation of falling, though his feet were firmly planted on solid ground. The world around him flickered as if it were struggling to stabilize, and when the light finally settled, he found himself in an unfamiliar setting. He stood in a high-rise office, its walls of glass offering a panoramic view of a bustling cityscape. The air was sterile, heavy with the hum of technology and the faint aroma of coffee. Daniel looked down at himself and froze. He was dressed in a sharp business suit, his reflection in the glass revealing a version of himself he didn't recognize. A sleek nameplate on the desk before him read, "Daniel Armitage, Financial Strategist." His pulse quickened as he realized where he was, or rather, when he was. This wasn't a moment from his past. It was a fragment of a timeline he had unintentionally created. Somewhere in his efforts to correct his mistakes, he had altered the threads of time enough to craft a life he had never lived. A knock at the door interrupted his thoughts. A woman entered, her confident stride and professional demeanor making it clear she was a colleague. She handed him a stack of documents, her expression businesslike but familiar. "Your presentation is in 30 minutes, she said without preamble. "Don't forget to review the projections for the investment portfolio." Daniel blinked, unsure how to respond. He didn't know her name, yet her presence felt strangely natural, as though she had always been part of his life. "Got it," he said finally, his voice steady despite the chaos in his mind. As the door closed behind her, Daniel rifled through the papers, scanning graphs and charts that might as well have been written in another language. The details were overwhelming, but one thing was clear. This version of himself was successful, respected, and deeply embedded in a world he had never aspired to enter. He left the office and wandered the hallways of the building, hoping to piece together the fragments of this timeline. Every face he passed greeted him with familiarity, and he responded with polite nods, trying to mask his disorientation. The walls were adorned with photos of corporate events, charity galas, and award ceremonies. In several of them, he saw himself, smiling and shaking hands with people he didn't recognize. One photo caught his attention. It was a candid shot of him at a charity dinner, standing beside the woman who had delivered the documents earlier. She wore an elegant evening gown, her hand resting on his arm. The caption beneath the photo read, "Daniel Armitage and Emily Reyes, partners in business and life." Daniel's stomach twisted. This wasn't just a career he didn't remember. It was an entire life, complete with relationships and accomplishments that felt alien to him. He thought of Ethan, wondering if his brother even existed in this version of reality. The locket around his neck grew warm, and Daniel felt the now familiar pull of the threads. The world around him shimmered, and he braced himself for another jump. This time, he landed in a memory, one he hadn't revisited in years. He was in a college lecture hall, sitting in the back row with his notebook open but untouched. The professor was discussing financial modeling, a subject Daniel had always found tedious. Yet here he was, staring at his younger self, who was diligently taking notes. Daniel felt a pang of recognition. This wasn't the life he had lived. It was the life he had avoided. In his original timeline, he had dropped this course after a week, convinced it wasn't for him. But something, or someone, had nudged him to stay. The lecture ended, and students filed out of the hall. Young Daniel lingered, gathering his things slowly. A man approached him, his presence unmistakable even in this crowd. The collector. "You have potential," the collector said, his voice low but commanding. "With the right guidance, you could achieve great things." Young Daniel looked up, his expression a mix of curiosity and uncertainty. "I don't even know what I want to do," he admitted. The collector smiled faintly. "That's the beauty of it. The possibilities are endless." Daniel watched the interaction in stunned silence. The collector had been meddling in his life long before their encounter on the Titanic. He wasn't just observing time. He was shaping it, molding it to his own design. The locket pulsed again, and Daniel was yanked back into the void. This time, the threads around him were frayed and tangled, their golden light flickering as though struggling to maintain coherence. The keeper's voice echoed through the expanse, resonant and firm. "The collector has altered more than your life," it said. His interference disrupts the balance of time itself. Daniel turned in place, trying to find the source of the voice. "Why me?" he demanded. "Why did the locket choose me?" "You are connected to the fractures," the keeper replied. "Your mistakes, your regrets, they are the anchor points. Through you, the threads can be mended." Daniel's frustration boiled over. "I didn't ask for this. I just wanted to fix my life. Not save time itself." The threads pulsed, their light intensifying. "Every choice creates a ripple," the keeper said. "Your journey is not about undoing the past. It is about understanding the cost of change." Before Daniel could respond, the threads surged around him, pulling him into another fragment of time. He landed in a dimly lit room filled with scattered artifacts. It took him a moment to realize he was back in the shop. The shelves stretched endlessly, their contents shimmering faintly in the subdued light. The shopkeeper stood behind the counter, their expression as inscrutable as ever. "You've seen the threads," the shopkeeper said. "Do you understand now?" Daniel approached the counter, his steps heavy. "The collector is manipulating everything," he said. "He's using time like a toy. How do I stop him?" The shopkeeper tilted their head, their gaze unyielding. "The locket is your key. It can guide you to the points where his interference is strongest. But every choice you make carries a price. Are you willing to pay it?" Daniel's grip on the locket tightened. He thought of Ethan, of the life he had left behind, and the one he had inadvertently created. He thought of the golden threads, fragile yet infinite, stretching out in all directions. "I'll do whatever it takes," he said, his voice steady. The shopkeeper nodded, a faint smile ghosting across their lips. Then the journey continues. The air around Daniel shimmered, the shop dissolving into golden light. He braced himself, ready to face whatever fracture lay ahead. The Temporal Anomaly Club. Deep beneath the streets of a bustling metropolis, hidden in a network of forgotten tunnels and catacombs, there was a place known only to those who had crossed the boundaries of time. It had no official name, but its members called it the Temporal Anomaly Club. The entrance was unassuming, a rusted metal door with no markings, tucked behind a maze of crumbling walls. To the uninitiated, it was invisible. To those who knew, it was a sanctuary. The club was more than a meeting place. It was a refuge for the scattered and the displaced. Its members came from every corner of history and every possible future. Some had stumbled into time travel by accident, a failed experiment, a mysterious artifact, or an unexplained rift in the fabric of reality. Others had mastered the craft, wielding their knowledge like seasoned sailors navigating a turbulent sea. The space inside was a chaotic blend of eras. A Victorian settee sat beside a neon holographic display. Gas lamps flickered on the walls next to panels of sleek, futuristic controls. The bar served drinks from across the timeline. Ancient meads, Prohibition-era cocktails, and synthetic liquors from centuries yet to come. On this particular evening, the club was alive with murmured conversations, the kind that hummed with the weight of shared secrets. The air was thick with stories of paradoxes narrowly avoided, timelines corrected, and moments that had slipped through the cracks of causality. At the heart of it all sat Elise, a former physicist from the 23rd century who had become something of a legend within the club. She was known not just for her intellect, but for her unwavering ability to spot patterns in the chaos of time. Beside her was Marcus, a traveler from the Renaissance who had accidentally fallen through a temporal rift and now spoke in a mix of Shakespearean English and modern slang. The club's members had grown accustomed to each other's quirks, but their camaraderie was born from necessity. They were the caretakers of time, bound by the unspoken rule that the timelines must remain intact, no matter the personal cost. That evening, the mood was tense. Elise leaned over the bar, her sharp gaze scanning a series of glowing reports projected onto a thin sheet of transparent material. The reports detailed a series of disturbances, paradoxes that had begun to emerge across multiple timelines. "These ripples aren't random," Elise said, her voice low and measured. "Someone's deliberately tampering with the flow." Marcus sipped his drink thoughtfully. But who would dare such folly? 'Twere not enough for us to merely mend the tears. They would weave chaos into the tapestry." Elise tapped the reports, her lips pressing into a thin line. "That's what we need to find out. The anomalies are growing in frequency and scale. If we don't stop whoever's responsible, the timelines could collapse entirely." At the edge of the room, a figure sat quietly, observing the scene. He was new to the club, having joined only a few weeks ago. He called himself Jack, though no one was entirely sure if that was his real name. Jack had a calm demeanor that belied his apparent lack of experience in time travel. He claimed to have stumbled into the club after finding an ancient artifact, though his story was vague and his answers evasive. Elise's gaze drifted toward Jack, her instincts tingling. Something about him didn't add up, but she couldn't afford to let suspicion distract her. The anomalies demanded her full attention. As the night wore on, the members of the club shared their findings, piecing together fragments of information from across the timelines. Patterns began to emerge. Sudden disappearances of key historical figures, events occurring out of order, and entire cities flickering out of existence before reappearing in a different time. The reports pointed to a single, unmistakable conclusion. Someone was deliberately introducing anomalies, and they were doing it with precision. Elise stood, her commanding presence silencing the room. "We're dealing with a saboteur," she said, her voice cutting through the murmurs. "This isn't just carelessness or experimentation. Someone is targeting the structure of time itself." The room fell silent, the weight of her words settling over the group like a heavy shroud. Marcus set down his drink, his expression grave. "Then we are beset with peril most dire. Pray tell, how shall we confront this villainy?" Before Elise could respond, Jack cleared his throat. "What if the saboteur is here?" he asked, his tone casual but calculated. The room turned toward him, the air crackling with tension. Elise's eyes narrowed, her sharp mind already turning over the implications of Jack's words. "What are you suggesting?" she asked, her voice dangerously calm. Jack leaned back in his chair, a faint smile playing on his lips. "Just that it's a little convenient, don't you think? All of us gathered in one place, with access to the timelines. If someone wanted to manipulate time, this would be the perfect cover." The room descended into a charged silence as Jack's words hung in the air. The hum of the club's eclectic blend of technology and history seemed to dim, as though even the machinery was holding its breath. Elise's sharp gaze lingered on Jack, her mind racing through the possibilities. His accusation was bold, but the logic was unsettlingly sound. "You think the saboteur is one of us," she said, her voice measured. It wasn't a question. It was a test, an invitation for Jack to explain himself. Jack leaned forward, resting his elbows on the table. His calm demeanor contrasted with the tension that radiated from the other members. "Look around," he said, gesturing to the room. "We're the only people who understand how time works, how fragile it is. Who else could create anomalies with this level of precision?" Murmurs rippled through the group. Marcus frowned, his fingers tracing the rim of his glass. "To suspect one of our own is a bitter draught to swallow. Yet his reasoning doth strike a chord." Elise silenced the murmurs with a raised hand. Her eyes never left Jack. "Convenient theory," she said. "But what makes you so certain? You've been here, what, a few weeks? And now you're pointing fingers?" Jack shrugged, the faintest hint of a smirk on his face. I'm just connecting the dots. You're the one who's been tracking these anomalies. Have any of them originated outside the club's reach? Elise's jaw tightened. It was a valid question, and the answer only deepened her unease. The anomalies had been precise, targeted at critical points in the timeline. Whoever was responsible had knowledge that only someone with access to the club, or its members, could possess. She straightened, her tone sharp. If you're going to accuse someone, Jack, you'd better have more than a theory. Jack held her gaze, his calm demeanor unshaken. I'm not accusing anyone, yet, but we all know what's at stake. If the saboteur is here, they're listening to this conversation. They're already planning their next move. Elise turned her attention to the reports displayed on the table, the glowing data casting a cold light on her face. The anomalies formed a complex web, their connections subtle but undeniable. Cities disappearing for hours before returning. Historical figures making choices that deviated from recorded events. Entire artifacts vanishing from one era and reappearing in another. One pattern stood out. The anomalies weren't random. They were centered around specific points in time. Events where small changes could have massive ripple effects. Whoever's doing this isn't just tampering with history, Elise said, her voice cutting through the tension. They're testing the boundaries of causality. They're seeing how much they can shift before the fabric of time unravels. Marcus leaned closer, his expression grim. A perilous game indeed. And yet, to what end? That's what we need to find out, Elise replied. The club's members began to split into groups, each assigned to investigate a different anomaly. Marcus and Elise took charge of coordinating the efforts, using their combined knowledge to track the saboteur's movements. Jack, to Elise's irritation, volunteered to assist her directly. As they worked, Elise couldn't shake her lingering suspicion about Jack. He was too calm, too confident for someone so new to the club. His knowledge of temporal mechanics was impressive, yet he claimed to have stumbled upon the club by accident. She decided to test him. Jack, she said as they examined a particularly strange anomaly, a medieval manuscript that had reappeared in a 24th century library. What's your theory on how this was done? Jack studied the data, his expression thoughtful. Temporal displacement caused by a controlled paradox loop, he said after a moment. Whoever did this knew exactly how to manipulate the anchor points in the timeline. They created a feedback loop to shift the object forward without destabilizing its original context. Elise raised an eyebrow. It was an advanced explanation, one that required a deep understanding of temporal physics. Not bad, she said, her tone neutral. Where'd you learn all that? Jack shrugged. You pick up a few things when you're stuck between timelines. The investigation continued late into the night, each discovery adding another piece to the puzzle. The anomalies were connected by a single thread, an energy signature that didn't match any known technology. Elise frowned as she examined the data. The signature was faint, almost imperceptible, but it was there in every instance. This isn't random, she muttered. Jack leaned over her shoulder, his eyes scanning the report. That energy signature, I've seen it before. Elise turned to him, her eyes narrowing. Where? Jack hesitated, his confident facade slipping for the first time. On the artifact that brought me here. The one I found before I joined the club. What artifact? Elise demanded. Jack reached into his coat and pulled out a small, spherical device. It was smooth and black, its surface etched with faint, glowing patterns. Elise's heart sank as she recognized it. That's not just an artifact, she said, her voice low. That's a temporal beacon. The room fell silent as the realization settled over them. Temporal beacons were rare, dangerous devices capable of anchoring someone to a specific point in time. They were also highly illegal, even by the club's loose standards. Where did you get this? Elise asked, her voice tinged with suspicion. Jack's expression darkened. It was left for me. I don't know who sent it, but it activated the moment I touched it. That's how I ended up here. Elise's mind raced. The beacon's energy signature matched the anomalies perfectly. If Jack was telling the truth, then someone had used him as a pawn, bait to infiltrate the club. Before Elise could press further, the club's lights flickered, and the air filled with a low hum. The room seemed to vibrate, the walls shifting as if the very fabric of time was unraveling. Marcus burst into the room, his face pale. An anomaly here. Someone's breached the club. The hum grew louder, and a crackling rift opened in the air, its edges glowing with unstable energy. Through the rift stepped a figure cloaked in shadow, their face obscured by a mask that shimmered like liquid metal. The room erupted into chaos as the club's members scrambled to respond. Elise grabbed Jack, pulling him behind a console. "Stay out of sight," she hissed. The masked figure stepped forward, their voice echoing with an unnatural resonance. "You cannot stop what is coming. The timeline will be rewritten." Elise's jaw tightened as she reached for a temporal stabilizer, her mind racing. Whoever this was, they weren't just tampering with time. They were declaring war on it. The air in the club crackled with energy, the presence of the masked figure turning the room into a storm of tension and chaos. The figure's metallic voice resonated, sending a chill through even the most seasoned members. Elise crouched behind the console with Jack, her mind racing to make sense of the situation. The figure stepped further into the room, their movements unnervingly precise, as though they were perfectly in tune with the fractured energies of time itself. Around them, members of the club scrambled to stabilize the room's temporal field, their devices emitting bursts of light and sound as they worked. But nothing seemed to affect the intruder. "You are wasting your efforts," the masked figure said, their voice echoing with a strange duality, as though two people were speaking in perfect unison. "The flow of time is no longer yours to protect. The anomalies are not errors. They are corrections. The old timeline must fall." Elise felt her pulse quicken as the figure's words settled over the room. This wasn't just a saboteur. This was someone who believed they were reshaping time for a greater purpose. Jack shifted beside her, his face pale but determined. "We have to stop them," he whispered. "No kidding," Elise replied, her tone sharper than intended. "But we can't just charge in blind. Whoever they are, they're controlling the anomalies, and they have the power to breach this space." "That's not random." Jack glanced at the temporal beacon in his hand, the faint glow of its patterns pulsing in time with the energy around them. "What if they're using this to track us?" Elise's eyes narrowed as she considered the possibility. The beacon's energy signature matched the anomalies, and its presence in the club could have acted as a beacon, literally, for the intruder. "If that's true," Elise said, her mind racing, "then we need to sever its connection to the anomalies." Before Elise could act, the masked figure raised their hand, and the air around them shimmered. A rift opened behind them, its edges glowing with unstable light. Through the rift, glimpses of other timelines flickered, cities collapsing, forests consumed by fire, and civilizations erased in waves of golden energy. "This is the future you are clinging to," the figure said, gesturing to the chaos. "A timeline of decay and failure. My work is not destruction. It is salvation." Elise stood, her jaw tight as she stepped out from behind the console. "Salvation?" she said, her voice cutting through the chaos. "You're destabilizing the timelines. You call this salvation?" The figure turned toward her, their mask glinting ominously in the light. "Destabilization is necessary for transformation. The old threads must be unraveled to weave a stronger tapestry." "Strong for who?" Elise demanded. "You? This isn't about saving the timeline. It's about control." The figure tilted their head, their movements eerily calm. You speak as one who fears change, but change is inevitable. It is the only constant in the flow of time. The figure raised their hand again, and another rift opened, this one closer to Elise. She felt the pull of its energy, a force that threatened to drag her into the void. Jack darted forward, grabbing her arm and pulling her back. "We can't fight them like this," Jack said, his voice urgent. "Not without a plan." Elise nodded, her mind racing as she scanned the room. The club's defenses were designed to stabilize anomalies, not repel a direct attack. But the figure's presence was tethered to the rifts they were opening. If the rifts could be closed, the figure's influence might weaken. "Get to the stabilizers," Elise said, her voice firm. "If we can collapse the rifts, we might be able to cut them off." Jack hesitated, glancing at the temporal beacon. "What about this?" "Bring it with you," Elise said. "If it's connected to them, we might be able to use it against them." As Jack sprinted toward the nearest stabilizer, Elise turned her attention back to the figure. They moved with a deliberate grace, their focus shifting between the rifts as though they were orchestrating a symphony. Elise reached for her own stabilizer, a compact device clipped to her belt. She activated it, and a pulse of energy radiated outward, colliding with one of the rifts. The rift flickered, its edges sparking as it began to destabilize. The figure turned sharply, their voice tinged with irritation. "You cling to a broken system," they said. "Your efforts are futile." Elise ignored them, focusing on the stabilizer's controls. She adjusted the frequency, sending another pulse of energy into the rift. This time, the rift shuddered violently before collapsing in on itself. The figure staggered slightly, their calm demeanor faltering. Elise allowed herself a flicker of hope. Whatever connection they had to the rifts, it wasn't as unshakable as they claimed. Meanwhile, Jack worked quickly, connecting the temporal beacon to the club's main stabilizer. The beacon hummed with energy, its glow intensifying as he adjusted the settings. Marcus joined him, his face tense as he monitored the stabilizer's output. "Can we overload it?" Jack asked. Marcus frowned. But such a gamble could tear the space asunder." Jack hesitated, then shook his head. "We don't have a choice. If we can sever the beacon's link to them, we might be able to stop this." Marcus nodded reluctantly, his hands moving deftly over the stabilizer's controls. The beacon's glow began to pulse erratically, its energy building to a dangerous level. In the center of the room, Elise continued to collapse the rifts one by one. Each success weakened the figure's presence, their movements growing less fluid and more erratic. But as the final rift began to close, the figure turned to Elise, their voice rising in pitch. "You think this will stop me?" they said. "You cannot destroy what is already set in motion." Elise gritted her teeth as she sent another pulse into the rift. "Maybe not," she said, her voice steady. "But I can stop you from making it worse." The rift collapsed with a deafening crack, and the figure let out a distorted cry. Their form flickered, their mask splintering as cracks spread across its surface. At that moment, Jack and Marcus activated the stabilizer. The beacon emitted a blinding flash of light, its energy surging outward in a wave that rippled through the room. The figure screamed, their voice fracturing into incoherent echoes as their form dissolved into the light. When the light faded, the rifts were gone, and the room was still. The club's members slowly emerged from their hiding places, their faces etched with a mixture of relief and exhaustion. Elise approached the stabilizer, her gaze falling on the now-dormant beacon. "Is it over?" she asked, her voice quiet. Jack nodded, though his expression remained troubled. "For now." But whoever they were, this wasn't the end. It was just the beginning. The aftermath of the attack left the temporal anomaly club in a tense silence, broken only by the faint hum of the stabilizers as they recalibrated the room's temporal balance. The masked figure was gone, their presence erased by the beacon's overload, but the weight of their words lingered like a shadow over the members. Elise leaned against the bar, her arms crossed tightly as she replayed the events in her mind. The figure hadn't been defeated, they had retreated. The rifts were closed, the immediate threat neutralized, but the underlying danger remained. Jack approached, the now inert beacon in his hands. Its once vivid glow had faded, leaving only faint etchings on its surface. He placed it on the bar beside Elise, his expression unreadable. "They'll come back," he said quietly. Elise nodded, her jaw tightening. "I know. Whoever they are, they're not finished. They think they're fixing time, reshaping it into something better. But their idea of better is tearing everything apart." Marcus joined them, his face pale but resolute. Their rhetoric reeks of hubris. To claim dominion over time itself, 'tis a folly most perilous. Elise glanced at Marcus, a faint smile breaking through her tension. "You always know how to put things into perspective." Jack's eyes remained fixed on the beacon. "We need to understand this," he said. "If it's the key to their operations, we can't afford to leave it as a mystery." Over the next few days, the club's members worked tirelessly to analyze the beacon. Its design was unlike anything they had encountered, a seamless fusion of ancient craftsmanship and advanced technology. The patterns etched into its surface seemed to shift under scrutiny, their meanings elusive. Elise led the effort, her background in physics and temporal mechanics giving her a sharp edge in deciphering the device. She spent hours poring over the data, her mind piecing together fragments of understanding. Jack remained by her side, his insights surprisingly helpful despite his short tenure in the club. "What do you think it is?" Jack asked one evening, breaking the silence. Elise frowned, her eyes scanning the glowing holographic projection of the beacon's internal structure. "It's not just a tracker or a tool for creating anomalies. It's more than that. It's like a bridge, a way to link specific points in time. Whoever built this didn't just want to travel. They wanted control." Jack leaned closer, his brow furrowing. "Control over what?" "Everything," Elise said simply. As their understanding of the beacon grew, so did their sense of unease. The energy it emitted, even in its dormant state, was enough to subtly distort the club's stabilizers. It was as if the device existed slightly out of phase with reality, a fragment of something larger and far more dangerous. Elise began to suspect that the beacon wasn't unique. If the masked figure had used one to breach the club, there were likely others scattered across the timelines. Each one could be a tool, a weapon, or a piece of a larger puzzle. "We need to track them," Elise said during a meeting with the club's senior members. "If there are more of these out there, we have to find them before they can be used again." Marcus nodded gravely. "A task most daunting, yet necessary. How dost thou propose we proceed?" Elise gestured to the holographic map that hovered above the table, its surface marked with glowing points representing the known anomalies. "The energy signature from the beacon matches every anomaly we've encountered. If we can amplify our sensors, we might be able to detect others like it." The club mobilized, dividing into teams to cover as much ground as possible. Elise and Jack took the lead on modifying the club's sensors, their shared focus driving them to work with an intensity that left little room for rest. As they worked, Elise found herself grappling with her growing trust in Jack. Despite her initial suspicions, he had proven himself time and again, his insights and determination aligning with the club's mission. Yet a part of her couldn't shake the feeling that his connection to the beacon was more than coincidence. "Why did you really join the club?" she asked one night, her voice cutting through the quiet hum of the equipment. Jack paused, his hands stilling over the console. "I told you. I found the beacon and it led me here." "But why you?" Elise pressed. "Why would someone leave it for you? What makes you so important?" Jack hesitated, his expression conflicted. "I don't know," he admitted, "but I'm starting to think it wasn't random. Maybe someone wanted me to be part of this." Elise's eyes narrowed. "And who do you think that someone is?" Jack didn't answer. The breakthrough came unexpectedly. As Elise fine-tuned the sensors, a surge of energy rippled through the club, setting off alarms and causing the lights to flicker. The holographic map glowed brightly, new points of light appearing in rapid succession. "What's happening?" Jack asked, his voice urgent. Elise's fingers flew over the controls, her eyes scanning the data. "The beacon. It's resonating with something. Multiple somethings. These must be the other devices." The map stabilized, revealing a pattern that sent a chill through the room. The points of light weren't random. They formed a network, each connected to the others by faint threads of energy. "It's a web," Elise said, her voice barely above a whisper. "They're using the beacons to create a network that spans the entire timeline." Marcus stepped closer, his face grim. "And what purpose doth this web serve?" Elise stared at the map, her mind racing. If they can control the network, they can control time itself. They could rewrite history, reshape the future. Everything. The realization spurred the club into action. Armed with the knowledge of the network, they began planning missions to locate and deactivate the other beacons. Each one would be a dangerous undertaking, requiring precision and coordination to avoid destabilizing the timelines further. As the first teams prepared to depart, Elise gathered the club's members for a final briefing. Her voice was steady, her determination unwavering. "This isn't just about fixing anomalies anymore," she said. "It's about protecting the integrity of time itself. If we fail, the consequences will be unimaginable. But if we succeed, we can stop this before it spirals out of control." Jack stepped forward, the dormant beacon in his hand. "What about this one?" he asked. Elise met his gaze, her expression resolute. "We keep it here. It's the key to understanding their network, and to stopping them for good." As the teams departed, Elise and Jack remained behind, their focus shifting to unraveling the beacon's secrets. The work was grueling, but the stakes were clear. They weren't just fighting to preserve history, they were fighting for the very fabric of existence. And as the days turned into weeks, Elise couldn't help but feel that their journey was only beginning. The web of anomalies was vast, its threads tangled in ways she couldn't yet comprehend. But one thing was certain: the fight for time was far from over.